Welcome to today's NWCC webinar. The topic of the webinar today is on estimating mitigation credits for golden eagles from both voluntary lead abatement and reducing vehicle collisions. This is Lauren Flynn with the American Wind Wildlife Institute. And wanted to apologize about confusions with the time. We have some time zone confusion, as I'm sure others have had, but we're glad you all could join us here right now. And we have blocked off an hour and a half for this webinar, but we do only have one presentation, in-depth presentation, and that will definitely finish before the end of the hour. We just wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions, but if folks need to jump off at 4, you will definitely be able to hear the whole presentation. Most of you should be able to hear us on your computers, and we're going to take questions in writing, so that should work. And hearing some folks say that the sound is not working. Just want to make sure that you guys on the computer can hear us. If you can hear me and you're listening on your computer, if you can just send a quick note in the Q&A pod to confirm. All right, looks like everyone can hear us. Sounds good. All right, thank you all. So we also, I think we'll have a few folks joining us on the phone, and if you can just remember to mute your phone line so there's no background noise, that would be great. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian to tell us a little bit about how we're going to do Q&A, and then we'll introduce our presentation.
Thanks, Lauren. Just a couple quick logistics notes here. For sound, Lauren went over the phone and computer things, but just a heads up, if you're having any technical issues with the webinar, please send me an email to ievans@awwi.org, and I'll troubleshoot as best I can. You can also send me logistics questions through the questions box in the webinar room. We'll be taking most of the questions for presenters at the end of the presentation today, but we do encourage you to submit your questions as they come up, and we'll pause as needed for clarification during the presentation. If you have a question for the presenters, please enter it in the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar screen. You can type your question into the dialog box at the bottom and click the button at the right, or hit enter to send it to Lauren and I at AWWI. You will only be able to see questions you submitted in the box, not those submitted by others. And finally, a reminder that we are recording this webinar today to post on the NWCC website in the next few days here, so other people who weren't able to make it can listen in. And with that, I'll turn it back to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Ian. So today's presentation is going to be an in-depth look at 2 important tools for golden eagle mitigation and conservation, which have been created by AWWI in collaboration with many experts, which Tabor will tell you more about. One of these tools was recently published, and the link to that publication should have been in the emails you got about the webinar. And then the other tool is currently under peer review. Today's presentation is going to be given by Dr. Tabor Allison, who is AWWI's Director of Research and Evaluation. And Tabor has been expertly leading AWWI's research program since 2010, and before that he was a Vice President at Mass Audubon. Tabor is an ecologist with special expertise in wind wildlife impacts, and he holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota. So with that, I will turn it over to Tabor to start the presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Lauren. And just to check, make sure you can hear me?
Yep.
Great. All right, well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you were able to get on this call, and apologize for the time mix-up. So as Lauren mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some work that we've done over the past 3.5 years to develop additional options to offset unavoidable take of eagles, particularly golden eagles, at wind energy facilities. And what I first want to do is acknowledge the primary and essential contributions of my co-authors, Jean Cochran, Eric Lonsdorf, and Carol Sanders Reed, who are really the technical experts leading this effort. And so I want to make sure that everyone appreciates that the importance of their contributions. So the webinar that I'm going to present, as I've mentioned, is on this development of offset mitigation options. And what I'll do first is just provide a little bit of context about this effort and why we're undertaking it. And then talk first about the general methodology that we used to develop these models, and then talk about the two models, the one we developed for voluntary lead abatement and one for reducing eagle vehicle collisions, and the results from those. We basically use the same approach to create both models, and then we'll talk about next steps and have a general question and answer period at the end. I will pause for clarifying questions between the discussion or presentation of the lead model and the eagle vehicle collision model, just to see if there is any questions people might have that would require some clarification. So in terms of the regulatory framework and that context, I think most of us are familiar with the 2009 Eagle Rule and the 2013 Eagle Conservation Plan guidance, which lays out an approach for how the Fish and Wildlife Service will permit take of eagles at wind energy facilities. And a wind energy company seeking a permit, a programmatic take permit, as laid out in the Conservation Plan guidance, would go through three basic steps in order to, as part of their permit application and as part of their eagle conservation plan. The first step would be to predict take using a service Bayesian model, and then the applicant company would implement advanced conservation practices and avoidance techniques in order to minimize and otherwise reduce that predicted take to the maximum extent achievable. And then any remaining take would be considered unavoidable. And for golden eagles, the service concluded that the species could not sustain any additional mortality, and therefore any unavoidable take would have to be offset, a numerical offset. So if you predict you would have an unavoidable take of 1 or 2 eagles per year, you would have to propose mitigation that would offset that take by either saving 1 or 2 eagles a year or creating 1 or 2 eagles a year. So AWWI, oh, I should point out that, as I think probably we also know, the service Eagle Rule is undergoing revision, and so some of the details that I'm talking about today may change when the rule is finalized. So AWWI, as in an effort to both help the service implement the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance and the Eagle Rule, and for companies to improve compliance with the rule, we developed a research framework that was to guide research to focus on the 3 steps that are involved in applying for a permit and preparing an Eagle Conservation Plan. And we're working in implementing that framework in all 3 areas. I won't talk today in any detail about the work we're doing in predicting and avoiding take or the development of ACPs, but we have active programs in those areas, and hopefully we'll have more to present on those topics at later webinars. So instead, what I want to do is focus on the third step of offsetting unavoidable take. And we began this particular effort in, got a bit ahead of myself here, my apologies. So let me just talk a little bit more about quantifying mitigation offsets. We know that the service has approved the use of power pole retrofitting to reduce eagle electrocutions as a qualifying mitigation strategy. And this relates to there exists a model that predicts when you retrofit a certain number of power poles that you will save a certain number of eagles. So in other words, power pole retrofitting has a basis that enables quantification and verification of the mitigation option. The service, in their conservation plan guidance, offered up additional potential options for offsetting take. And I've highlighted the ones that I'll be describing, either by reducing vehicle eagle collisions or through lead abatement programs. And the challenge for these alternative offsets is that they currently lack a model to predict the effect of that particular mitigation option on whether or not you're trying to save eagles or create eagles. So the potential options are not quantifiable or verifiable. For example, if you have a potential or predicted unavoidable take of 1 eagle a year, what we don't know, if you want to save eagles by reducing eagle vehicle collisions, we don't know how many miles of road we would need to drive in order to remove carcasses that eagles would feed on. And we don't know how many carcasses we'd have to remove in order to save that eagle. So basically, all these other mitigation options lack a model that would enable us to quantify and also verify the effectiveness of the mitigation option. So to address that challenge, we started our compensatory mitigation project in the late summer of 2012. And the goal of this project was to develop predictive models for compensatory mitigation that would numerically offset eagle mortality, predicted and unavoidable eagle mortality at wind energy facilities. One of the challenges of developing these models is that the lack of important and necessary empirically based data to parameterize the models that one might develop to predict or the effectiveness of the mitigation. So we used a technique called expert elicitation, which I'll talk a little bit more about in some detail, where we relied on the judgment and experience of experts, subject matter experts, in this case experts in golden eagles, to help us develop models, identify key variables, and then parameterize the variables in the models to generate the predictions and the predicted effect of the mitigation. Then our plan is to work with stakeholders, agencies, the industry, and the conservation community to both evaluate and implement these models at wind energy projects and as part of eagle conservation plans. Our long-term vision is to expand the toolbox so that we have reliable options that can be used depending on the particular circumstances for a project. We intend to complete 3 of these models, and Lauren mentioned this in the introduction, that we have completed a model for voluntary lead abatement, which was published in the journal Ecological Applications in Print last September. And we have a vehicle model that we have completed, and we have a manuscript in review right now, hoping to hear any day about that. And then we have a third model that we're currently developing, looking at the effects of enhancing prey habitat on eagle productivity. So the first two models, the lead model and vehicle model, are about reducing eagle mortality. And our third model, the habitat model, is aimed at increasing eagle productivity. I want to note that with the vehicle model being in peer review, those of you familiar with the peer review process know that manuscripts that get submitted for peer review frequently undergo revision. So that may, and I anticipate that there may be some revisions to our work on the vehicle models. So the results that I'm going to describe should be considered provisional. So what I'd like to do next is just take some time to go through the general steps and methods that we followed to create these models. First, we assembled a team of subject matter experts, eagle experts, golden eagle experts specifically, and for the lead abatement model, we assembled a team of lead toxicologists. We made a number of simplifying steps to help improve the tractability of the work that we're doing. So we chose to focus on a specific geographic area, in this case Wyoming, which is known to have a very high resident and winter eagle population. We utilized a structured approach to elicit the expert judgments. For those of you who aren't familiar with expert elicitation, it is a formalized process to basically quantify the judgment and experience of experts to create, in this particular case, a model and parameterize that model. So we use the expert judgments both to help us design the models for lead abatement and vehicle collisions, and then to assign values to the parameters in the model. We captured expert uncertainty and diversity in their responses in the form of probability distributions. And I want to just show you a little bit of what that might look like with this sample elicitation. This elicitation specifically was focused on trying to estimate the relationship between blood lead levels and eagle mortality. So you can see first that we made and described to the experts several assumptions that we wanted to make sure they understood. And then we asked them the question specifically that given the maximum lead level at any time during a month, we asked them to estimate the probability between 0 and 100 in this case of mortality. And in particular, we asked them for their lowest estimate at a particular blood lead level, the highest estimate, and what they thought the most likely estimate or of the probability would be. And then we asked them how confident they were in their results. And so this kind of process was followed with every elicitation that we did with our experts, a similar process. And what the output looked like, in this particular example, we had 4 experts, and you could see, if you keep in mind the questions that we were asking them, estimating the probability of mortality at particular blood lead levels, you can see each expert's response. The diamond reflects their most likely or best estimate of the mortality at a particular blood lead level, and then the lines indicate the difference between their lowest and their highest estimate. And these results were then combined to create a probability distribution for this particular variable and for any variable for which we elicited expert opinion. Oops. We then created a custom computer model that incorporated these variables and the distributions around these, the parameters of these variables in order to estimate eagle deaths from the particular mortality source. And we estimated those deaths by running simulations, thousands of simulations of the model with stochastic sampling of the parameter values from the distributions that we developed for each of the particular variables. And then we used those simulations, the results of those simulations, to estimate the variance in the expected outcomes. We then conducted sensitivity analyses of key parameters in the models in order to identify which variables were most important in explaining variation in our mortality estimates. And this was an iterative process. We worked closely with the experts. We reviewed their judgments and their opinions to make sure that everybody understood the questions, because one of the major sources of error in expert elicitation is what might be called an epistemic error, which is that the expert didn't really understand the question. So we would review the experts' results and revise the results if it turned out they didn't understand the question. We then would run the simulations and review those results with the experts as well. So it's an iterative process throughout. So what I first want to do is describe the model for voluntary lead abatement. And in this particular case, the mitigation options that are typically considered for reducing lead and availability and lead poisoning in eagles is gut pile removal. So when a hunter kills a deer, they typically field dress the animal and leave the gut pile out, and eagles feed on that gut pile, which oftentimes contains a fair amount of lead fragments in it. So the mitigation approach would be to remove that gut pile and make it unavailable to the eagles. The second option is getting hunters to switch to a non-lead ammunition. And so we worked with our experts. You can see here's a list of the experts that participated in this process. The eagle experts are in the black font, and the lead experts are in the red font. And one of the things I just want to draw your attention to, you could see that we had experts from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So working on both of these models, we worked closely with service staff to make sure that the approach we were using was consistent with how they were envisioning both the development and use of offset mitigation options. So the first thing we did was to create a model, and I want to walk through this a little bit to make sure you understand particularly the different color coding. The
Tabor, I'm going to pull up the arrow here. Oh,
okay.
You got it.
Okay, where'd it go? So first of all, we have the mitigation options, gut piles removed, and ammo switching. In this case, we tracked them by the percentage of gut piles removed and percentage of hunters switching to non-lead ammo. The green boxes you see up here were important variables: golden eagle density and game harvest. These are known inputs in the sense that we put these in the model. Wyoming has very detailed game harvest records by game management unit. And then West Inc. Provided us with golden eagle densities for those game management units based on the aerial surveys that they have been conducting with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The variables in the gold or orange boxes, hopefully that's what those look like to you, are variables that were the parameters of which were elicited from the experts. So we asked the experts to tell us how many gut piles they think an eagle would ingest over the course of winter season, how much blood lead they might ingest per gut pile, and then you may recall the relationship between mortality and maximum blood lead level. The gray boxes are variables that were calculated in the course of the model. And then you can see these all ultimately predict the number of eagles dying. And so what we first did was create a model that predicts the number of deaths of golden eagles in Wyoming due to ingestion of lead during the big game hunting season in the fall. And we then used input various mitigation scenarios to see what the effect of that mitigation would be on the number of eagle deaths. To make sure people understand, the direction of the arrows indicates that a particular variable has an influence on the variable that the arrow is pointing to. So, for example, the number of gut piles per eagle influences and was used in the calculation of expected maximum blood lead, along with the blood lead per gut pile. So those two variables and those two variables in particular were used to calculate this variable. So the arrows show the influence of one variable on another. I guess we could remove that. So one of the important elements of this whole process was to be as transparent as possible in the calculations and assumptions we were making. We made several simplifying assumptions, and you can see that we've listed the major assumptions here, that eagles are adept at finding gut piles. You can calculate scavenging rates from eagle density. Maximum blood lead is a useful index of mortality. Predicting probability of mortality within 1 month is a reasonable approach, and that we used a population-based rather than an individual-based model in order to represent natural variation in individual eagle deaths. So in other words, variation in individual eagles in susceptibility to lead poisoning or how they might forage or any other variation among eagles is captured by taking this population-based approach. So as we've mentioned, the results of this work have been published and the details are available. I'm not going to go through the details, but I just wanted to provide a few highlights that our model estimated that 3% of the Wyoming eagle population dies from lead poisoning related to big game hunting, and that lead shot replacement is a more effective mitigation strategy than gut pile removal. As you can see, you could remove 50% of the gut piles, and that our model only predicted that to lead to a third reduction in mortality. And that is, we think, because eagles are saturated with gut piles. There are many more gut piles out there than eagles could actually eat. So removing gut piles doesn't have the effect of reducing lead availability, if you will, in a linear way. But one of the things I did want to do is talk about some of the key variables in the model through our sensitivity analysis that these variables that you see listed here were the most important in explaining variation in our model output. And what that indicates is which variables would be the most useful to evaluate in the field in order to, or to measure in the field in order to evaluate the predictions of the model. So, for example, variable number, what I've listed under number 3, number of gut piles eaten in a month, that's and the lag time between gut pile ingestion, depending on what the estimate was that was used in the model output, that had a great effect on our estimate of eagle deaths. And so those would be two variables that would be useful to measure in the field in order to evaluate the model. So what I'd like to do is run through a scenario about how the model might be used in a mitigation setting. So, for example, if you have a particular unavoidable take that you need to offset, and you wanted to know, set up a program to reduce lead through hunter participation in a voluntary program, you might want to know what percentage of participation in switching from lead to non-lead bullets is needed to offset your unavoidable take. Alternatively, if you had prior information and knew or had an expected level of hunter participation, how many eagles would we save in the area that we want to run a program? And then finally, if there are different levels of risk tolerance, for example, the service staff who are discussing the eagle permit want to be conservative and not overestimate the mitigation potential, what might that look like? So we ran a scenario and chose a particular region of Wyoming, the Casper region, that includes several big game hunting units that covering an area of approximately 16,000 square kilometers. We estimated an unavoidable take of 5 eagles per year, which I think we know is actually a very high and typically unlikely eagle take at most wind energy facilities in the country, which, are much, the predicted take is substantially less than that. But we chose a high take in order to determine the sufficiency, if you will, of the a lead abatement strategy. And we talked about model inputs. We had key model inputs of eagle abundance and lead availability as estimated in the number of gut piles per eagle. And these graphs show the model output. And so first, what I want to draw your attention to on the graph on the left is the expected or median estimate of the number of eagles saved based on the mitigation rate, or in this case, the percentage of hunters switching to non-lead ammunition. And so what we're looking at is the number of eagle deaths avoided or eagles saved as a function of hunter participation in a mitigation program. And so what you can see is that for our target take of 5 eagles, we would estimate that you would need an approximately 30% participation rate in an ammo switching program. Alternatively, if you look at the graph on the left, these contain the more conservative approaches. If you wanted to use, instead of using the median or expected outcome, you used a more conservative result of the 20th percentile, which not coincidentally mirrors the service's use of the 80th percentile for their take prediction. What you can see is that to accomplish an unavoidable an offset of 5 would require an almost 60% participation rate. If you estimated, going back to the graph on the left, if you estimated that a participation rate was 50%, you could see in this region of Casper, Wyoming, and the hunting units with the eagle densities that we described, you could save 8 eagles or avoid 8 eagle deaths. Alternatively, if you wanted to estimate not just the 20th percentile, but also a more conservative participation rate, then you might save 2 eagles. So the point of this is to show that the model output enables a variety of different approaches to estimating the mitigation credit for voluntary lead abatement. So I'm going to pause there for a few minutes to see if anybody has any clarifying questions before I go on to vehicle collisions.
Thanks, Tabor. 2 questions have come in so far that I think should be pretty fast, so why don't we do these? The first one is asking if the model accounts for subacute levels of lead poisoning that could cause eagles to become disoriented or otherwise impaired and thus cause death indirectly.
Short answer is no. We recognize that that was a possibility, and a future elaboration of the model could take into account what I would call sublethal effects of lead.
Thanks. And the other question, not sure if you know this, but is asking how many eagles does 3% of Wyoming eagles roughly amount to?
Boy, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember that off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Okay. A couple more have come in. One is the eagle mortality rate per year?
It's the mortality rate is based on the period that we defined as the big game hunting season. So basic and that winter, so October through March.
Gotcha. Okay, I think this is another pretty quick one. In the mitigation model example, did you use all big game species in the hunt zones or one particular species?
We used all.
Okay.
So elk, pronghorn, deer, mule deer.
Let's see.
Although there are not that many.
Okay, I think this is a 2-part question. One is asking about who the lead experts were, so maybe we go back to that, to the list of experts.
All right.
You want me to, I can pull it up. If no.
Go back.
Go back further.
Yeah. You just almost there. One more. Oop, where'd it go?
There we go.
There. Yeah. So there you are.
And then were all these lead experts, or?
The 4, Chris Franson, Tara Kelly, Pat Rettig, Bruce Rideout, yes, they were our lead toxicology experts.
Gotcha. So the names in red were the lead
The
experts.
names in red, yeah. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Thank you. And then the other part of the question is asking if eagle-led mortality is seasonal, tied to large game hunting, or is it more year-round?
Well, that was another simplifying assumption that we made. We focused just on lead inputs during the big game hunting season. However, we also acknowledged that eagles could potentially ingest lead at other times. As our experts described, what is often referred to as plinking, which is when people go out and shoot small game like jackrabbits or prairie dogs, and those can be eaten by eagles, and eagles could ingest lead as a result of that. So we weren't modeling that, but again, that could be an additional source of lead and a future elaboration of the model. I think, just in general, we made, as I indicated at the outset, we made several simplifying assumptions in order to improve the tractability and see what kind of result we could get, whether or not a lead abatement program focused just on a particular source of lead would provide sufficient mitigation credit.
Great, thank you. And there's one other question, but it's kind of bigger picture, so I think we could save that till the end. So let's jump back to this slide and pick back up again.
All right. So the second model is looking at reducing eagle vehicle collisions. So a car or a truck hits a deer, the carcass remains along the roadside or in the road. Potentially eagles, golden eagles, feed on those carcasses, and then they themselves get struck and suffer injury and death. So again, we used the same process with many of the same experts that we used on the lead model. We had a couple of additional people that we added, and I want to particularly point out Clint Bowl, who joined us for this effort and is a co-author on the manuscript that we produced, and we've been working very closely together with Clint on this project. But we used the same approach of expert elicitation, and again, we used the experts to help us first design the model and the model structure with the arrows pointing from one variable to another, showing influence of one variable on another in the same fashion. In this particular case, the blue variables are known inputs. So we used roadkill data and that was available. Again, we're working in Wyoming, and we're now focusing even more closely on a particular county in Wyoming. It happens to be Natrona County, if anybody knows where that is. So we got roadkill data from the county. County road crews do conduct maintenance, and they remove carcasses from some roads at varying intervals, primarily for safety reasons, but that was important to include in the model. We also looked at eagle density and traffic volume. So those were known variables, and then, or with known inputs, I should say. And then the orange boxes are the variables for which we elicited expert judgments. And then the green boxes are variables that were calculated from the known inputs and the expert elicited numbers. But just to highlight some of the things, variables, so vehicles per hour is an important variable. And we asked the experts to evaluate the disturbance rate. So when a vehicle comes along and an eagle is feeding on a carcass, the eagle is disturbed and flies away. And that reduces exposure. So in many cases, the eagle, this disturbance rate, the eagles can avoid. And there's an interaction between this avoidance behavior of the eagles and the number of vehicles per hour. So that's something, that a kind of variable to keep in mind. We also looked at age. We assumed that juvenile eagles less than 1 year, fed more frequently on roadkill than eagles greater than a year. And so we included, we estimated an age ratio in the population of 17% juvenile eagles. So this is basically the structure of the model that ultimately calculations work their way through to estimate the number of eagles that are killed by vehicles as they feed on roadkill. We made assumptions, as I mentioned, total scavenging use or use hours, so basically increased gradually with eagle density. You can question that assumption, but again, to make the process tractable, we just assumed a particular functional response to total use hours and eagle density. I mentioned the age structure of the population that we factored into the model of juvenile eagles and eagles older than 1 year. And then we particularly, as we were focusing on Natrona County, we focused on a time period between October and March, and we focused on small ungulates, deer in particular, because there weren't a lot of large ungulates like elk that were killed in this particular county. So we focused our efforts on that, and the size of the carcass was estimated as part of the elicitation as it affected persistence and availability of the carcass to eagles. So just going immediately to our simulation results, so we basically did the same thing we did with lead. We created the parameters and the distributions for the parameters from expert judgments and available information. And then we created a model and we simulated it 5,000 times. And here you're looking at output where we're interested in the total eagle deaths as it is a function of vehicles per hour or traffic volume, holding all the other variables in the model constant. And what you show here are the percentile distributions of the simulation results. So by that definition, the 100th percentile includes all of the results of the 5,000 simulations. And down here, circled in red, is the median or expected result, or the 50th percentile output of eagle deaths and by traffic. And what you see is fairly obvious, is that the total number of deaths increases initially with traffic volume, but then actually declines with traffic volume and essentially goes to zero at the highest traffic. And that reflects that interaction that I mentioned before between traffic volume and disturbance to the eagles and the collision probability for eagles. Basically, at the highest traffic roads, eagles are disturbed so often that it reduces exposure of eagles to the point where their collision probability declines. If you essentially add up the results for these curves, for the median result, the expectation of the number of eagles killed by vehicle traffic in Natrona County between October and March is approximately 6 eagles during that time period. Golden eagles in particular is what we're talking about. So what we're doing here, in addition to emphasizing sufficiency, we looked at efficiency. So not only are we asking to what extent do we generate mitigation credits, but what is the effort involved in generating those credits? So the mitigation strategy in particular is removal of roadkill. And so the question comes up, he said, what interval is the most efficient for checking roads to remove carcasses from the roads? And that interacts with a variety of things, including the fact that road maintenance crews are also out there removing carcasses. So if we just do a simple estimate of mitigation credits with the median expectation at different removal intervals, you can see that, not surprisingly, the more frequently you remove carcasses, the more eagles you save, and that tends to increase with road vehicle traffic. The effort or total driving, in this case, the thousands of kilometers that you have to drive, of course, goes up with your mitigation effort in this case, a nonlinear fashion, so that at one interval days of one removal intervals of one day, you're driving a lot. And the effect when you combine these two situations, what you find is that mitigation efficiency actually declines with removal intervals. So you may be saving more eagles, but you have to drive a lot further per eagle saved. And in this particular case, the examples here, the most efficient removal interval was 4 days. And that interacted with vehicle traffic and the removal schedules of road maintenance crews. And so one of the things you can do is, in designing your mitigation, is you can look at a road map of, in this case, Natrona County, and you can estimate your mitigation credits and your efficiency and design a mitigation program by looking at the roads. And what you basically, the thicker roads, the roads that have the thicker lines, you generate more mitigation credits per kilometer driven, and so it's more efficient to focus your effort on those roads. And in particular, you can see that state roads, which are in red, have very low efficiency. So basically, what we found is that you can generate sufficient offset credits, but at least in Natrona County, you have to drive a lot to do it. So it takes a lot of effort. But our efficiency analysis would help improve the efficiency of that effort.
Okay, we're sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to note the time. We told folks we'd finish up the presentation by 4, so about 5 more minutes.
I'm almost done.
Excellent.
So these are the key variables. And again, with the sensitivity analysis, one of the utilities of doing a sensitivity analysis is to identify which variables could and should be evaluated with field work in order to improve the predictions of the model. So you could, for example, observe scavenging rates of eagles at particular carcasses, because that's an important variable. On the other hand, the age ratio of juveniles to older eagles was less important. So the highlights, carcass removal efficiency was highest on low traffic volume roads. There are fewer eagles on those roads because there are fewer carcasses, but those roads also have less frequent road maintenance. It's important to update the predictions of the model. We did this for Natrona County, and you'd want to go out and evaluate some of the parameters that we use for that county. But for any county where you might, or any geographic area where you might do this, you would want to get site-specific parameters, including roads and traffic, the road maintenance schedule, and roadkill abundance and distribution. But in particular, eagle carcass use and avoidance behaviors are high priority targets for study. And finally, what our efficiency analysis showed that if you have a higher offset credit needed, that rather than increasing your removal interval from, say, 4 to 2 days, you would actually just go to another area and work there. That would be a more efficient use of resources. So finally, in summing up, the two options that we looked at do provide sufficient offset credit, but it's important to emphasize that the models are really hypotheses. They provide a basis for quantifying and verifying the effects of particular mitigation options. But it is important to evaluate those hypotheses and those predictions in the field. And so the lead model, we're looking for partners to test and improve the model. For the vehicle collision model, as I mentioned, we have a paper in review, but we're working with Clint, currently conducting a feasibility study of some of the techniques to measure some of the key variables that we're working with the intention of implementing more complex field trials this winter, or coming winter 2016, 2017. And then finally, as I mentioned, we intend to complete a prey habitat model sometime this fall. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you. Just in time. So we've got lots of questions that have come in, and we have a full 30 minutes to continue to take questions, so we'll keep going as many questions as we have until 4:30 Eastern. So just a quick reminder, if you have a question, you can type it into the box at the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar window. We don't have the ability to do audio questions, so please type it into the box, and then we'll read them out for Tabor to answer. So, Tabor, I'll just, a couple of these are going back to the lead model, so why don't we start with those?
Sure.
So this question is asking if you can use the lead model to estimate eagles saved by closing an area to big game hunting. Could it be done by setting harvest to 0 or gut piles removed or non-lead ammo used to 100%?
Yes. You could, I mean, basically the analogy would be if you closed a game management unit and had no hunting in there, you could argue that you're reducing lead inputs by 100%. Or alternatively, you could issue permits. If you're a landowner, private landowner, and owned a large amount of land, you could restrict hunting access to those hunters who only use non-lead ammunition. And you could use the model to estimate the mitigation credit. You'd need to get an estimate of your eagle density, and you'd need to know otherwise what your harvest is. Great,
thanks. All right. So this question is asking about the fact that in California, lead ammo has been will be outlawed in 2019, but that shotgun and small mammal and bird hunting lead restrictions phase in starting this year. And does the model assume any gradual declining of lead mortality due to this regulatory reduction that's scheduled?
Well, the model is not, well, let me figure out the best way to answer this. The model, we parameterized the model and used known inputs of lead from harvest data, hunting harvest data, and eagle density for Wyoming. And any other place you'd want to use the model, like in another state, would require you to develop estimates for eagle density and harvest data for that state. In the case of, so the model, because California is banning lead, the model as currently configured would not necessarily be useful there, particularly after the lead ban went into effect. But it's not, the use of the model per se is not dependent on what's going on in California. Alternatively, if there continue to be sources of lead input into the environment in California, the model could be adjusted to account for those different sources of lead input. Instead of gut piles, we would basically estimate the source of lead from shooting of small game and that sort of thing. And you know, we could do that. It would involve an additional elicitation to probably estimate the feeding rate of eagles on the small game and the lead input from eating small game. But the model provides a framework for doing that.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's see. I'll look through this list here and see if there's any that jump out as related to the lead model. These are all, I believe, for, so here's one, asking if you have a sense of why gut pile removal wasn't as effective as the ammo substitution.
Not sure what happened there. We think it's because eagles are saturated with gut piles. So there's so many gut piles out there, for example, within a particular game management unit, that if you removed a gut pile that had lead in it but didn't otherwise change the use of lead ammunition, so that you're basically only decreasing lead inputs by removing gut piles, the eagles would find another gut pile with lead in it and ingest lead. So, you know, there is some effect. It's actually something of a nonlinear decline as you remove gut piles, but you have to remove a lot more gut piles to have the same effect as you would get with ammo substitution until you got to the point where eagles were limited by the availability of gut piles and therefore reducing their lead inputs. Does that answer that question, I hope?
Hopefully. If you have a follow-up, feel free to send it along in the pod to whoever asked that question.
And you can also email me with any questions.
Yes, definitely. So a couple questions have come in, and see if I can try to capture them. I think they're basically kind of related to, are there any connections between these two models, the lead model and the vehicle model? Whether, you know, could you run them in combination to look at cumulative impacts, or the fact that, you know, removing carcasses that might have lead in them from the roadside could have an impact as well. Can you talk a little bit more about whether there's any linkages there or not?
Well, there's no explicit linkage in the models. One of the things we did do when we got the output was we compared the output to other estimates of eagle mortality from lead poisoning or from vehicle collisions to check the plausibility of our results, and in reference to estimates of the total percentage of the eagle population, which is estimated to die annually in this particular case in Wyoming. So, you know, we didn't, the cumulative mortality from lead and vehicle collisions, you know, we made those comparisons to make sure that they didn't exceed the known mortality and therefore represent an implausible result. We have talked about more explicitly linking the models, and this goes back to a question that somebody asked about sublethal effects and whether or not sublethal levels of lead might reduce an eagle's ability to avoid collisions and factor that into a model, but we haven't done that yet.
Great, thanks. All right, so I think most of these now are related to the vehicle model, so we'll turn to that. But if you've got questions on the lead model, feel free to keep typing them in, and we can turn back to that. So I'll just kind of start going down the list here. This question is asking if the age variable can be verified through carcasses collected along roads.
Of eagles? Carcasses of eagles? Is that what they're...
I guess so.
Well, the age ratio could be first validated by observing eagles feeding on carcasses, because we assumed that there would be a greater proportion of juveniles feeding on carcasses than older eagles. So that could be verified by field observation. And presumably, you know, you could go out. We did have an estimate of juvenile deaths versus older eagles. That was part of the output of the model. I didn't talk about that explicitly, but you could do that. You could get that estimate. I think one of the, you know, just to add to that, the collision, one of the most important variables in our model as affecting the sensitivity, you know, the output, not surprisingly, was our estimate of the collision rate, number of, you know, the probability that an eagle would be struck by a passing vehicle. And that's a parameter that would be very difficult, both ethically, I'd say, as well as just methodologically to estimate. So, you know, that's why we're talking about focusing on more tractable variables to evaluate in the field.
Great, thanks. So, question going back, I think probably to the flow chart. If total carcasses and vehicles per hour are knowns, why isn't the collision rate per vehicle a calculated value from current conditions and data? Does that make sense, or?
I'm going to go back to the model. Okay, can you repeat the question then, please?
Okay, so it says if the total carcasses and vehicles per hour are knowns, then why isn't collision rate per vehicle a calculated value from current conditions and data?
Well, all right. Total carcasses, to be clear, if I wasn't, I apologize, is roadkill. So, the carcasses that eagles feed on, not eagle carcasses, but carcasses of, in this particular case, small ungulates. So you wouldn't, as I understand the question, there may have been a confusion in thinking total carcasses was number of eagles.
Gotcha. Yeah, sounds like it.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. What is the time frame for total eagle deaths as a function of VPH, vehicles per hour, right?
I'm not sure how they're using time frame. So vehicles per hour is the traffic volume. And what was the first variable they asked about?
The time frame for total eagle deaths.
So total eagle deaths is the, so if you have a road that has 30 vehicles per hour, then the model estimates all other variables held constant. The number of estimated eagle deaths on a road with that roads with that traffic volume in the county in a 6-month period between October and March.
Okay.
So we
thanks.
figure out the total, availability of roads with a certain traffic volume, and then with all the other variables that we're using, estimate the eagles killed on those roads in the county.
Over that 6-month
Over
period.
that 6-month period.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Hopefully that's
It's
clear.
complicated stuff. All right. If you already said this, I apologize, but did you consider speed limit as a factor that might affect eagle-vehicle collisions?
I think the short answer is no. It was focused more on traffic volume rather than vehicle speed.
Gotcha. All right. So this is, I think, probably a similar answer, but just to confirm, is there any insight about the influence of traffic type on the probability of eagle injury death? So, a passenger vehicle versus a semi-truck?
We did not. We just assumed a vehicle is a vehicle. We didn't take into account trucks versus cars. We did consider the characteristics of the roadside. So, for example, was the road going through a forested landscape versus an open landscape, under the assumption that trees growing up closely to the road might make it more difficult for an eagle to avoid because they have to get height as well as distance. But that turned out not to be important in our model. Not that it is unimportant, but it didn't factor into our result in any significant way.
Okay. Let's see.
I mean, I'll mention this. People are bringing up a lot of interesting questions about variables, and as I mentioned, we did make a lot of simplifying assumptions, and one of the things that will be important to do is to evaluate whether or not we oversimplified the model and missed some important variation that we should try to tease apart and account for in the model. So some of these variables, by simplifying, we're basically saying that variation that might contribute, sources that might contribute to variation in a variable were not considered. and we made those assumptions deliberately and hopefully describe all those assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Thanks. All right. This question is asking about the eagle density estimates that were used, the data, and that I'm not sure if this is the case, but maybe you can say a little bit more about that they're for breeding populations and that they don't account for migrants and wintering eagles. So could you say anything more about that?
I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
So the eagle density estimates that were used from West as the basis for the models?
Right. Yeah.
And
so we likely underestimated eagle density is the short answer because of the potential for migrants and the winter population being higher than just the breeding population. So that would be a useful parameter to evaluate. Yes, I agree.
Gotcha. All right. Let's see. This person is asking if you could say a little bit more about the feasibility study that Clint is doing and any potential field studies, so looking more at kind of verification.
Well, right now, we're evaluating ways of counting traffic and recording eagle use of carcasses. So we're evaluating really the technology that we would use in a larger study to see whether the technology gets us the kind of information that we would want for the evaluation. So, we want to get better estimates of vehicle traffic, and we want to get better estimates of vehicle use. How long are vehicles, how long are carcasses available to eagles? How during that period of availability, how many eagle use hours are there on those carcasses, and to get avoidance rates, disturbance rates with traffic as traffic goes by. How often are eagles flushed, and how does that interact with traffic volume? So, we made a variety of assumptions and elicited expert judgment on that, and so we're testing technology that might help us evaluate those expert judgments.
Gotcha, thanks. Kind of along those lines, we had a question come in, I think more about kind of how would you implement something like this, and what would the mitigation dollars pay for? Would it be to pick up roadkill, and would that need to happen as long as the wind farm is in operation? Would you be able to say a little bit more about what this could potentially look like in action?
Well, yes, the short answer is that depending on where you are, if you have a project in Natrona County, for example, you would use our output to design a mitigation program, and you would then go out and drive roads and remove roadkill at, let's just say, given our results, at a 4-day interval. And do that and cover enough roads to accomplish or get the mitigation credit that you need. So, you might run the model and say, if I need to offset one eagle, how many miles of road do I need to drive, and how many carcasses do I need to remove in order to get that offset credit? And if you're working in another county, you'd need to get data that I mentioned on one of the last slides, but you'd want to get data on roads and traffic volume, so there'd be an eagle density, so there'd be a fair amount of effort up front in preparing and designing the mitigation strategy, and then in having somebody execute it by driving roads and removing carcasses. And I guess one thing I haven't mentioned, but the assumption is that you wouldn't necessarily remove the carcass and make it unavailable to the eagle, but you'd remove it off the road far enough away so that the eagle wasn't at risk, but the carcass was still available.
Gotcha. Thank you. This question going back to the lead model and asking if we've looked at all at the Arizona Condor program for reducing condor mortality from lead.
Well, I mean, we certainly used that program as a model, and we're aware of the hunter participation rates. I'm not aware that there's been any evaluation of, that program was intended for condors, is my understanding. And I don't know if there's been any evaluation on lead inputs. To what extent, they've evaluated the effectiveness of the program other than to say, this is our participation rate in terms of gut piles removed and hunter switching.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let's see. There's several questions in here kind of asking about different factors, whether or not they were considered. And I know you've talked quite a bit about that. See if there are any that I think we haven't touched on yet. And there was a question about whether different types of vehicles were considered, but also is there insight about the relative importance of the types of carcasses that are available to eagles? So, is there a higher risk to an eagle if it's dining on a large mammal versus, something else?
Well, that we factored in carcass size. We've got the model still up here, but you can see one of the calculated variables is exposed carcass days, and that is influenced by the removal interval by road crews, and also the total number of carcasses and the type of carcasses. So we had large ungulates, small ungulates, and then we had smaller mammals like coyotes, and was one size class, and jackrabbits was a size class. And we estimated, as you can see there, days per carcass. So the experts were asked to estimate the days of availability of a carcass based on carcass size. So we did take that into account in general. In particular, for our example, we limited ourselves to small ungulates because of the kind of roadkill information or data that was available for Natrona County. But the model is able to take into account carcasses of different sizes, and as our experts estimated, smaller carcasses persisted for less time than a larger carcass. Alternatively, road crews might focus their removal on larger carcasses because of the safety hazard they impose, and we took that into account as well.
Gotcha. Thanks. So I don't think you've touched on this. Apologies if you did already. This is asking about the fact that vehicle collisions often result in latent fatality. So the eagle doesn't die immediately on impact, but it might later. And is that considered? Does that factor into the model at all?
Well, we didn't explicitly discriminate that latent mortality. We basically asked our experts to estimate a collision rate per eagle, per vehicle for eagles. So it was just what is the probability, and the assumption was is that if it's hit by a car or a truck, it's killed. Whether or not that might have affected their estimates, their judgments, I don't know, but we just made that assumption up front.
Gotcha. Thanks. Let's see if there's anything else that hasn't really been touched on yet here. I think, so this question is a little bit outside of the scope of the models themselves, but I think it might be helpful for folks. So this is talking about when you're determining what the mitigation obligations are, and is population size included in that? And so, if the population changes over time during the operation of the wind farm, would your mitigation levels change? Is that something you could say a little?
I'm not sure I can speak to that.
Okay.
Because that's really something that the service, it'd be a conversation between the company operator and the service.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here, so wanted to wrap up. Thank you so much, Tabor. I know this is a lot of information, and it's complex information, which is why we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to cover it and go into questions. Thank you all for your many great questions. If you still have something that we didn't address, feel free to send it along to us. All of our email addresses are on the website, the AWWI website. So definitely reach out to us. And, as Tabor mentioned, our next steps are really wanting to kind of get these, I think they're not, looking for folks to test these models and improve them. So if this is of interest, please be in touch. Reminder that we did record this, and we'll post this on the NWCC website shortly. And also, before we wrap up, for those who are still on the phone, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder about the Wind Wildlife Research Meeting. This will take place November 29th through December 2nd. We're going to be back in Broomfield, Colorado at the same Omni Resort we were at for the 2014 meeting. And this will be the 11th meeting since 1994. And for those of you who are new to the meeting, it provides a forum to share wind wildlife science, and usually we have over 300 people attend. We expect to release a call for abstracts in May, and for those of you working on research, we hope you will consider submitting an abstract, and registration for the meeting will open in September. So we hope to see you all there. So with that, we'll wrap up for the day, and have a great afternoon all. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.